Rebecca stepped off the train in Silver Creek, her hands clutching a letter that promised a new life. She was here to marry a man named James Oakley, a man she'd never even seen. But the rancher waiting on the platform, tall and weathered by the Montana sun, stared at her telegram like it was written in a foreign language. Confusion darkened his face. Then anger. "I never sent for a bride," he growled, his voice a low rumble. "And I sure as hell don't want one." Rebecca's world tilted. Her fingers, suddenly numb, fumbled with the contract. The address was clear. Silver Springs, Montana. Not Silver Creek. A single word, a single mistake, had stranded her 1,500 miles from home with nothing but the clothes on her back and a trunk full of useless hope. The October wind sliced right through her dress as the train's whistle blew a final, mournful cry. It was leaving, and it was the only train for 3 weeks. James Oakley stood before her, a man who looked like he'd forgotten how to do anything but survive. His blue eyes were filled with a weariness that went bone deep. Behind him, a boy of about 10 peered around his legs, his own eyes wide with a strange mix of curiosity and hope. "Ma'am, you need to get back on that train," James said, his voice tight, controlled. He took a physical step back from her, as if her very presence was a disease he was terrified of catching. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and she could see them shaking. It was too late. The train was already pulling away, its smoke billowing into the cold mountain air. "That was the only train this week," Rebecca whispered, the words catching in her throat. "The station master said the next one isn't for 3 weeks." 3 weeks. The color drained from James's face. He looked anywhere but at her, running a hand through his dark hair. "No, that's not possible. There has to be another way." The station master, a kind-eyed old man, just shook his head. "Silver Springs is 200 miles north. Stagecoach runs once a month. You just missed it by 2 days." He eyed Rebecca's thin dress. "That'll run you $50, ma'am. If you can find a seat." $50. Rebecca felt a wave of dizziness. She had exactly $3 to her name. Everything she owned in the world was in the battered trunk at her feet. "I can't afford that," she said, the shame burning her cheeks. "I can't afford anything." "Pa?" the boy said, tugging on James's coat. "What's happening? Is her name really Rebecca? Is she really supposed to marry a James Oakley?" "Hush, Ethan!" James snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He softened his tone, but the desperation was still there. "Go wait by the wagon, son." As the boy walked away, James turned back to Rebecca. For a split second, she didn't see anger in his eyes. She saw pure, undiluted panic. He looked terrified. "Miss, I'm sorry for your trouble, truly, but I can't help you. Find a room in town." Rebecca lifted her chin, clinging to the last shred of her dignity. "Is there a boarding house?" "Mrs. Peterson's place," he said, his jaw tight. $3 a week. That's $9 for 3 weeks. You got that kind of money?" The question was a slap in the face. "No, sir," she admitted, her voice a bare whisper. "I have $3 total." The silence that followed was suffocating. James looked like a trapped animal. He kept a solid 5 feet between them, as if she were a carrier of the plague. She had never felt so utterly alone, so completely unwanted in her entire life. "Pa!" Ethan called from the wagon, his young voice cutting through the tension. "You can't just leave her here. She has no money and nowhere to go." "Ethan, I said hush!" James roared, but his voice broke on the word. He squeezed his eyes shut, his face twisting in a silent battle against himself. When he opened them, he looked like a man who had already lost. "What's your name?" he asked, the words sounding like they were physically painful to say. "Rebecca. Rebecca Chun." "Miss Chun," he began, then stopped. He couldn't seem to make himself finish the sentence. "My ranch is 3 miles from town. I could use help. Cooking. Cleaning." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "My boy and I. We haven't been managing so well. Not for a long time." Hope, fragile and dangerous, flickered in Rebecca's chest. "I can offer you room and board," he said, the words forced out between clenched teeth. For 3 weeks. Until the next train. You'll stay in the barn loft. You'll work for your keep. That's all. Nothing more. I'm a hard worker, Mr. Oakley, Rebecca said, her voice shaking with relief. I won't be any trouble. I promise. Trouble? James muttered, so low she almost didn't hear it. Then, louder. The barn loft. You stay there. We don't speak unless it's necessary, and you stay out of my way. He turned on his heel and walked toward the wagon, his shoulders rigid with a tension that seemed to radiate off him in waves. As James loaded her trunk, his hand shook so badly he almost dropped it. She pretended not to notice. Climbing into the back of the wagon, she couldn't help but wonder what had happened to this man to make him so afraid. It wasn't just anger, it was terror. What had happened 10 years ago? And why, as they rode toward his ranch, did she have the sinking feeling that 3 weeks in this place might just destroy them both? The cold in the barn loft was a physical thing. It seeped into Rebecca's bones as she woke, her breath misting in the air. For a moment, she let the despair wash over her. She was sleeping in a barn, 1,000 miles from home, because of a stupid mistake. But then she pushed it aside. She had work to do. She would prove her worth. The main house was solid and well built, but it felt wrong. A coldness emanated from it that had nothing to do with the morning chill. She pushed open the kitchen door and stopped dead. The room was a disaster, but it was more than that. It was a tomb. A woman's faded apron hung on a peg by the door. Delicate curtains, once white, were now gray with a decade of neglect. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, as if the world had stopped turning in this house 10 years ago. These weren't the signs of a bachelor's mess. They were the signs of a life abandoned in place. She moved into the living room, and the feeling grew stronger. A rocking chair sat by the fireplace, covered in dust so thick you could write your name in it. And above the mantel, where a family portrait should have been, there was only a rectangle of cloth, draped over the frame, deliberately hiding the faces from view. Her fingers itched to pull it away, to see what secret James was hiding from the world. You're still here. Rebecca spun around. Ethan stood on the stairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His face broke into a wide, genuine grin when he saw her. I thought maybe Pa would have made you leave in the night. Ethan. James's voice came from behind his son, low and full of warning. He was already fully dressed, as if he hadn't slept at all. His pained eyes landed on Rebecca, standing in the middle of his dead wife's living room. What are you doing in here, Miss Chun? The barn. That was the deal. I came to make breakfast, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I assumed that was part of my keep. His jaw tightened, but he gave a sharp nod. Fine. Make breakfast, then clean this room. He paused, his eyes darting around the space as if he were seeing the decade of dust for the first time. Just don't touch anything that doesn't need cleaning. He herded Ethan out the door for chores, and Rebecca set to work. She found eggs, bacon, flour. As she cooked, she couldn't shake the image of that covered portrait. What kind of man preserves a home like a museum to his own grief? When she called them in, the smell of fresh biscuits and coffee filled the air. James stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening at the sight of a proper meal. They ate in a tense silence, but Rebecca watched him. She saw him close his eyes after the first bite of a biscuit, a flicker of something that wasn't pain crossing his face for just a second. After they left for the north pasture, Rebecca made a decision. She would clean this house, but she would do it carefully. She would bring it back to life without erasing the ghost who so clearly still lived here. She was dusting the mantel, carefully avoiding the covered portrait, when her fingers brushed against something tucked behind a stack of old newspapers. It was a small music box, made of polished wood. Without thinking, she picked it up and opened the lid. A sweet, tinkling melody filled the silent room. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking sound she had ever heard. She was so lost in the music, she didn't hear him come back. What the hell do you think you're doing? His voice was like a thunderclap. Rebecca whirled around, nearly dropping the box. James stood in the doorway, his face a mask of white-hot rage, and something else beneath it. Raw, agonizing pain. "I said," he hissed, his body trembling, "don't touch anything." "I'm sorry," she stammered, placing the box carefully back on the mantel. "I was just dusting." "That was Catherine's," he choked out, the name cracking in his throat. "My wife's. Everything in this house was hers. And you have no right." He was shaking from head to toe, losing a war against a decade of buried emotion. "You think cleaning will fix this?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think dusting away 10 years will make any difference? This house is exactly as it should be. Dead. Frozen." Rebecca found her voice. "This house isn't a tomb, Mr. Oakley, and you and your son shouldn't have to live in one." "You don't know anything about it," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the covered portrait. "You don't know what it's like to lose someone because of your own stupid pride, to know that if you'd just done things differently, she'd still be alive." His voice dropped, becoming hollow and dead. "It was a fever. She got sick, and I was too proud to ride for the doctor. Too stubborn. Money was tight, and I thought I could handle it myself." His voice broke. "By the time I went for help, it was too late. She died while I was gone. Ethan was 2. He doesn't even remember her." "I killed her, Miss Chun," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers, and they were filled with a self-hatred so profound it made her flinch. "As surely as if I'd used a gun. And I swore I would never let another woman get close enough to hurt me again. Ever." He looked at her then, truly, looked at her. "And then you show up, by mistake, needing help. And I was fool enough to let you stay." He shook his head, a broken man. 3 weeks, Miss Chun. Then you get on that train, and you go to your new life. And I go back to mine." He turned and walked out, leaving Rebecca alone in the silence, the echo of the music box still hanging in the air. The wall he'd built around his heart had just cracked. She had 20 days left. 20 days to convince this man that living wasn't a betrayal. She just didn't realize that bringing this house back to life might mean uncovering a secret far more dangerous than grief. The music box incident created a fragile truce. James still kept his distance, but he stopped treating her like a ghost. So Rebecca began her quiet work. She started with small things, deliberate acts of defiance against the gloom. She scrubbed the windows until sunlight streamed into rooms that had been dark for 10 years. She found a vase and filled it with wildflowers from the meadow. James would stare at them during their silent meals, a muscle twitching in his jaw, but he never told her to stop. She mended his shirts, stitched the worn cuffs on Ethan's trousers. Simple acts of care the house hadn't seen in a decade. And slowly, James started eating his meals at the table again, instead of standing by the stove like a stranger in his own home. One evening their hands brushed as they both reached for the biscuits. James flinched back as if he'd been burned, his face going pale, but he didn't flee the room. That night, he broke days of silence. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice rough. "You'll be gone in 2 weeks." Rebecca met his gaze across the table. "Because Ethan deserves a home, not a museum. And so do you." Something shifted in his eyes. Not gratitude, not yet. But something else. Maybe fear. Then the storm hit. It rolled in off the mountains without warning, a furious squall of wind and rain. Rebecca was in the barn, making sure the horses were settled, when the wind tore at the old building. She heard a groan of stressed wood, a sound like a gunshot, and then a crack. Pain exploded in her leg as a heavy beam crashed down from the loft, pinning her to the hay-strewn floor. She screamed his name. "James!" She heard the frantic pounding of boots across the muddy yard. Ethan burst through the door first, his face a mask of terror. "Pa! Miss Rebecca's hurt!" James was a second behind him, and in that moment, the man who had kept 5 feet of distance between them at all times, the man who flinched from a simple touch, crossed the space in 2 strides. For the first time in 10 years, he touched a woman who wasn't a memory. His hands shook violently as he heaved the beam off her leg. He scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, his face a storm of emotions she couldn't decipher. He didn't carry her to the barn loft. He carried her into the house, through the kitchen, and laid her gently on the couch in the living room. The couch where no one had sat for a decade. "I've got you," he kept repeating, his voice raw. "You're safe. I've got you." The words were a mantra, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. The doctor from town came and went. Her leg was badly bruised, maybe a sprain, but nothing was broken. She just needed to stay off it. James sat in the dusty rocking chair all night, a silent, sleepless sentinel. When Rebecca woke in the gray light of dawn, he was still there, his face etched with a worry that looked dangerously close to care. "You stayed," she whispered. "I couldn't leave you," he admitted, and the words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. There was no question of her returning to the barn. James moved her into his own bedroom without a word, taking a cot in Ethan's room for himself. The forced proximity was a strange kind of intimacy. He brought her meals on a tray. He helped her hobble to the window to watch the sunrise. And in the quiet moments, they started to talk. She told him about Philadelphia, about the teaching post she'd lost, about the desperation that led her to answer an advertisement in a newspaper. "I was looking for a fresh start," she said with a wry, sad smile. "I seem to have misplaced it." He was quiet for a long time. Then, he spoke his wife's name again. "Catherine. She was like this sunlight. She could find joy anywhere." He swallowed hard. "When she died, the light just went out. I didn't know how to turn it back on." On the third evening, she was strong enough to stand at the window on her own. He stood beside her, his arm instinctively going around her waist to steady her. It was the closest they had been since he carried her from the barn. They watched the sun bleed orange and purple across the horizon. "Maybe," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been in the dark for so long, I forgot what light looked like, until it showed up at the wrong station." Her heart hammered against her ribs. He was looking at her, really looking at her. And for the first time, she saw the man he must have been before his world ended. She had 10 days left. 10 days until the train would take her to Silver Springs, to a man she was legally and morally bound to marry. But as James Oakley's arm tightened around her waist, she realized with a terrifying clarity that she had found a home. She just wasn't sure if she could keep it, or if the secrets this town held would tear them all apart before she even had the chance. The accident had broken more than just a beam in the barn. It had shattered the careful distance James had maintained for a decade. With only 9 days left until her departure, the air in the house was thick with unspoken feelings, a fragile hope warring with the ticking clock. Ethan's 10th birthday arrived 5 days before the train was due. Rebecca found James in the barn, deliberately avoiding the house, his hands working on a bridle he'd already fixed twice. "He's your son, James," Rebecca said softly from the doorway. "He deserves a celebration. He deserves to see his father smile." James's hands went still. "I haven't celebrated anything in 10 years. "I know," she said, stepping closer. "But you're not honoring Catherine by burying yourself alive. She wouldn't have wanted this for him, or for you." His jaw worked, a muscle ticking violently. "What if I don't know how?" "Then we'll remember together." That evening, the smell of baking cake filled the house for the first time since Catherine died. When Ethan came in from his chores and saw the small, lopsided cake with 3 flickering candles on the table, his eyes filled with tears. James emerged from his room, his face pale but resolute. In his hands, he held a small wooden box. He opened it to reveal a gold pocket watch. "It was your grandfather's," he said, his voice thick. I was saving it for today." Ethan couldn't speak. He just launched himself at his father, wrapping his arms around his waist. For a second, James stood rigid, a man unused to affection. Then, slowly, his arms came up and held his son tight. They ate cake and told stories. They actually laughed. And in the candlelight, James looked at Rebecca with a raw gratitude that stole her breath. When Ethan blew out his candles, he squeezed his eyes shut. I wish Miss Rebecca didn't have to leave, he whispered into the sudden silence. The unspoken wish hung in the air, a beautiful, impossible dream. Later, James found her on the porch. "You've given him more in 3 weeks than I've given him in 10 years, he said quietly. "You gave me a place to stay when I had nothing," she replied. "This isn't your home," he said, his voice turning rough again. "You belong in Silver Springs with—" he couldn't say the other man's name. "With a man I've never met, a man I only agreed to marry because I was desperate. Is that really where I belong, James?" She turned to face him in the moonlight. The air crackled between them. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling as they hovered inches from her cheek, then he snatched it back as if he'd been burned. "I can't ask you to stay. I have nothing to offer you, just a broken man in a broken house." "That house isn't broken anymore," she whispered, "and neither are you. You're just too afraid to admit it." He turned and walked away into the darkness, but not before she saw the tremor that ran through his shoulders. 2 days later, the sheriff rode up to the ranch. He wasn't there for a social call. He handed Rebecca a telegram. It was from Silver Springs, from the other James Oakley. He had received word of her delay. The contract, it read, would still be honored upon her arrival. But there was another line, a strange, chilling line. "Looking forward to you joining me to finally settle our family's outstanding debt." A family debt? What was he talking about? Rebecca stared at the paper, a cold dread creeping up her spine. This wasn't just a marriage contract. This was something else entirely. She had a promise to keep, a legal obligation. But her heart was here, in this house that was no longer a tomb. Ethan found her in the barn loft, clutching the telegram, tears streaming down her face. "Please stay," he begged. "Pa loves you. I know he does. He's just scared." "Sometimes love isn't enough, Ethan," she whispered. That night, she heard footsteps stop outside her bedroom door. She opened it to find James standing there, his hand raised as if to knock, his face a portrait of indecision. They just stared at each other, 1,000 unspoken words screaming in the silence between them. "Tomorrow," he finally whispered, his voice ragged. "Before you go. There's something I need to show you." He was gone before she could answer, his footsteps retreating down the hall. 2 days. 2 days until the train would carry her away to marry a stranger and settle a debt she knew nothing about. And whatever James needed to show her, she had a terrible feeling it was the one secret he had guarded for 10 years. The secret that might finally set him free, or break them both for good. The morning was heavy and still, thick with unspoken goodbyes. The train was coming tomorrow. Rebecca's life in Silver Creek was down to its final hours. After a silent breakfast, James found her. His face was pale, but his eyes were resolute. "Come with me." He led her not outside, but upstairs, to a locked door at the end of the hall. The one room she had never entered. He pulled a key from his pocket, a key that looked like it had been carried for a very long time. "I need to," he said, his voice cracking. "I need to stop living in a tomb." The door swung open on a cry of rusty hinges. The room inside was a shrine. It was Catherine's sewing room, left exactly as it was the day she died. A piece of mending lay across a chair, needle still in the fabric. A book lay open on a small table, its page marked. It was so perfectly preserved, so haunted. Rebecca felt like a trespasser on sacred ground. James stepped inside for the first time in a decade. His face crumpled. "The fever came on so fast," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It was the middle of winter. The snow was deep. I was so sure she'd get better. We'd had a bad year, money was tight. And I was so damn proud." The tears he had held back for 10 years finally came. They streamed down his weathered face, silent and devastating. "I told her to rest. I made her soup. I convinced myself I could handle it." His voice broke. "By the time I swallowed my pride and rode for help, it was too late. She died right here, in my arms, begging me to take care of our boy." He finally looked at Rebecca, his eyes swimming in a grief so profound it was a physical force in the room. "I killed her, Rebecca. with my stubbornness. She moved to him then, her own tears falling, and wrapped her arms around his shaking frame. "You didn't kill her," she said, her voice fierce. "A fever did. Bad luck did. But not you." He clung to her like a drowning man finding a raft. "I swore I'd never risk that pain again. 10 years, Rebecca. I've been dead for 10 years. He pulled back, his hands coming up to cup her face with a devastating gentleness. "And then you showed up. By mistake." His thumb brushed away one of her tears. "God help me, Rebecca. I don't want you to leave." Her heart stopped. This was it. The words she had been longing to hear. "Then ask me to stay," she breathed. Longing and terror warred on his face. For one breathless, eternal second, she saw him about to say it. She saw him choosing life, choosing love, choosing her. Then the light in his eyes died. "I can't," he whispered, the words like stones. "You have a life waiting for you. A contract. A man who isn't. This." He gestured around the room, at himself, at the ghost of his past. "You deserve better than a broken man who forgot how to live." He dropped his hands and walked out, leaving her alone in Catherine's room with the pieces of her broken heart. The final evening was an exercise in torture. Ethan cried openly at the dinner table. James was a statue carved from grief. Rebecca went to bed early, unable to bear it, and lay awake all night, listening to the sound of his restless pacing on the floor below. Dawn came, gray and final. He loaded her trunk into the wagon in a dead silence. The ride to the station was a funeral procession. The train was already there, hissing steam, a monster waiting to steal her away. As he helped her up the steps, his hand lingering on hers, she couldn't stop herself. She grabbed his arm, her grip desperate. "James, ask me," she begged, her voice breaking completely. "Ask me to stay. Ask me to forget Silver Springs and that contract and the other James Oakley. Ask me to marry you instead." His face was a mask of pure anguish. His mouth opened, and for one last, single, soul-crushing moment, she thought he would finally break. She thought the walls would finally come down. "I can't," he whispered, his voice shattered. The train door closed between them. Through the glass, their eyes met. His, drowning in unshed tears. Hers, already overflowing. The train lurched forward. She watched him shrink on the platform, a man choosing his tomb over a future. The station disappeared. The town disappeared. The wrong turn that had felt so right was now just a painful memory, fading behind her as the train carried her toward a life she didn't want, and a secret debt she was somehow meant to pay. James stood on the platform until the train was a speck on the horizon. He had done it. He had let her go. He had done the noble, selfless thing, and it felt like ripping his own heart out. He climbed into the wagon and started the long, silent ride home. The sun was bright, mocking him. Everything inside him had gone cold again, colder than before. Because this time, he knew exactly what he was missing. He knew what light felt like, and he had willingly chosen the dark. Halfway back to the ranch, he saw a figure sprinting down the road, waving its arms frantically. It was Ethan. He was out of breath, his face red, his eyes wild. James pulled the wagon to a halt. "What is it, son? What are you doing?" Ethan gasped, grabbing the side of the wagon. "She's gone, Ethan," James said, his voice flat and dead. "It's done." "You love her," Ethan shouted, and hearing the words spoken aloud made James flinch. "And you just let her go. She has a contract, a promise. I can't ask her to break it." "You can." Ethan's small hands grabbed the front of his father's shirt. "Make her a better offer. Give her a reason." The boy's voice broke, tears streaming down his face. "Ma would want you to be happy, Pa. I want you to be happy. Don't you get it? You've been dead for 10 years and I've had to live in that tomb with you." James stared at his son, truly seeing the depth of the boy's own loneliness for the first time. "Ma would hate what you've become," Ethan sobbed. "She'd hate that you've wasted 10 years punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. She'd hate that you're doing it again. Right now." Something cracked deep inside James's chest. the sound of ice breaking after a long, frozen winter. "It's too late," he whispered. "The train. It hasn't picked up speed yet." Ethan pointed down the road. "It's still crawling up the valley grade. Ride, Pa. For once in your life, fight for something." James looked from his son's desperate face to his own empty hands. He heard Catherine's voice in his memory, her last words to him before the fever took her. "Don't you dare waste the life I'm leaving behind, James Oakley. Don't you waste it." He had wasted 10 years. He would not waste another second. In one fluid motion, James spun the wagon around, whipping the reins so hard the horses lunged into a gallop. "Go, Pa!" Ethan screamed, running alongside for a few feet, his fist pumping the air. "Go get her!" James rode like a man possessed. He rode like a man who had been given a second chance at life. The wagon bounced and skidded, but he didn't slow. He could see it now. The train. A black snake crawling slowly up the long grade. It was still possible. He urged the horse faster, closing the distance, pulling alongside the rumbling train cars. "Rebecca!" he yelled, his voice raw. "Rebecca!" Faces appeared in the windows, staring at the madman chasing a locomotive. He didn't care. He just kept yelling her name. Then he saw her. Her face pressed against the glass 3 cars up, streaked with tears, shocked and beautiful, their eyes locked. And Rebecca didn't hesitate. She reached up and pulled the emergency brake cord with all her might. The train screamed. A horrible, grinding shriek of metal on metal as it shuddered to a halt. James leaped from the still-moving wagon, stumbled, and ran for her car. He burst through the door to find her standing in the aisle, surrounded by stunned passengers. He stopped, suddenly aware of all the eyes on him. The conductor was yelling, passengers were grumbling. James only saw her, the woman who had shown up by mistake and thawed his frozen heart. He dropped to one knee. "I've wasted 10 years," he said, his voice ringing through the silent train car. "I won't waste another day." Tears spilled down Rebecca's cheeks. "You came here by mistake. Wrong town, wrong rancher. But maybe," he swallowed hard, "maybe some mistakes are meant to happen. Maybe you were right where you were supposed to be all along." He pulled his wedding ring from his finger, the simple gold band he had worn like a penance. "I don't have a contract. I can't promise you an easy life. All I can promise is a man who will spend every day learning how to be the husband you deserve. A man who loves you so much it terrifies him." His voice broke. "Marry me, Rebecca. Please, marry me." The train car held its breath. Rebecca was crying, but she was also laughing. A sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yes," she whispered, holding out her hand. "Yes, James. I'll marry you." He surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, kissing her like a man who had been starving and just found a feast. The entire train car erupted in cheers and applause. "Folks," the conductor said, a grin spreading across his face despite himself. "You getting back on this train, or you getting off?" James looked at Rebecca. She looked at him. "Off," they said in unison. Hand in hand, they stepped off the train and onto the tracks, watching as it pulled away, carrying her trunk, her contract, and her old life toward Silver Springs. Ethan came running up the road, whooping with joy when he saw them. James pulled them both into a hug, his family, whole at last. "Let's go home," James said. A month later, another telegram arrived. This one was from the sheriff in Silver Springs. The other James Oakley, it turned out, was James's estranged cousin, a man known for his debts and his deceit. He'd heard about a mail-order bride from a wealthy family and hatched a scheme. He'd intentionally sent her to the wrong town, hoping his heartbroken, reclusive cousin would be forced to take her in and solve his problem. The family debt was a lie, a fiction created to ensure she wouldn't turn back. He'd never wanted a wife. He'd only wanted her dowry. James read the telegram, then looked at Rebecca, her hand resting on his. He laughed, a real deep laugh that shook the last of the ghosts from the corners of the house. His cousin's bitter plot hadn't led to his ruin. It had led to his salvation. The house was different now. The windows were open. Flowers bloomed on the sills. Catherine's portrait smiled down from the mantel, a cherished memory, not a haunting presence. James played her piano now. the melodies filling the rooms with life instead of silence. They sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky. Ethan was on the steps, whittling. James's arm was around his wife. "Best mistake I ever made," Rebecca murmured, "was getting off at the wrong station." James kissed her temple. "Best mistake I ever made was letting you stay." Sometimes, he thought, the wrong turns lead us exactly where we were always meant to be. If you enjoyed this story of a love found by mistake, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.